Welcome to the Andrew Holland Podcast, where we talk about business, entrepreneurship, and everything in between. Now, here's your host, Andrew Holland.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Andrew Holland Podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Holland. I'm a businessman. I'm an entrepreneur. I've worked as a CPA in the corporate world, and I've worked in the financial services and investment industries. I've started and ran multiple companies with multi-million-dollar revenues, and I've sold companies with multi-million-dollar exits. Thank you so much for joining us each and every week for the Andrew Holland Podcast, where we talk about business, entrepreneurship, and everything in between. You can find out more about the podcast at our website, theandrewhollandpodcast.com. Also, join us on Twitter, where we continue talking about conversations outside of the podcast during the week. My Twitter handle is @HollandPodcast. That's @HollandPodcast. Lastly, subscribe to our YouTube channel, the Andrew Holland Podcast, where you'll get weekly updates of the video version when it's posted every Wednesday. Today, I have a very special guest joining me in studio. He is not only my business partner, but my best friend. And it's been a long time coming since I wanted to have him in the studio. Adam, welcome to the Andrew Holland Podcast.
Thanks, Andrew. Honored to be here.
So, obviously, you and I know a lot about our history and our story, but for the viewers, one of the reasons I think it's so important for us to have this conversation is a lot of people think, boy, let's start a business, and they want to get into business with their friends. Well, that can be a good idea, and that can be a bad idea. And obviously, you and I have been in a number of businesses together where it's just us two. We've been in a number of businesses where it's been us two and other business partners. So I want to get into all that. But before all of that, let's back up. Let's talk about our history, how we know each other. We're both, of course, great Wisconsinites, Midwestern folk, and we met in college. But I want you to tell the listeners your story from your perspective, how we met, the path that you took. We took separate paths outside of college, and then kind of how you got to where you are today.
Well, similar to you, I grew up in a small town in central Wisconsin. Went to the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire, where we met, as you mentioned, and studied finance there. Also played intercollegiate golf for a small Division III school, which we were at the time. And after school, I decided that I wanted to get into finance, and the easiest path for me at the time, because of another friend of mine at the time who was working in financial services, was to become a financial advisor. So I started to practice. They threw a phone book at me the first day and said, here's your contact list. Good luck.
Now, did you intern with them during college?
I didn't. I worked for a different firm during college.
Okay.
And the opportunity there was to continue to kind of be a advisor support role, and I wanted to had that entrepreneurial drive, which we can get into later in my family's background, but I came from a family of entrepreneurs. And so my motivation was to stake it out on my own and give it a go, starting from zero, which is what I did.
And so you were looking to, in that industry, build a book of business.
Correct.
And so basically you're pounding the streets and you're trying to help people manage their money, and you started from nothing.
Yeah, and to be honest, I was quite poor at it at the beginning. I thought that growing up in a small town and having the background that my family did as a business owner, that I would make some phone calls and people would open up their wallets and their checkbooks with smiles on their face and write me large checks to invest for them. Unfortunately, that wasn't my experience for pretty much the first 5 years.
You sounded like I was, very young and naive and ready to conquer the world, and we thought it would just fall into place.
Precisely.
It's not quite like that. Now, I want to, before we move on, back up. Talk to us about your childhood. When did you determine that you wanted to be an entrepreneur? Did you determine that? A lot of people are hesitant. They're maybe in a job, or they're working for someone else, or they're working in the corporate world, and they think they're an entrepreneur, but they're not sure. Tell us from your perspective what it means to be an entrepreneur, how you knew you wanted to be an entrepreneur. You said your family comes from an entrepreneurial background. Give us a sense of that.
Yeah, I don't want to discourage anybody that doesn't come from an entrepreneurial background, because I did. And certainly, if I think about my childhood and moving from high school into college, I don't know that I ever had any doubts that I would ever do anything differently. It just was something I was used to, and I saw my dad both struggle and have great success in a short period of time. And so for me, that was kind of the only option to be an entrepreneur.
So you had seen it so much growing up that fear that is prevalent with anybody who's never done it before, and I'm sure you were afraid, but it seemed more normal to you because
Certainly.
you grew up with it.
Certainly.
Okay. So give us
And
a
that
little...
might not come natural to some,
Yeah.
but that shouldn't discourage them from trying or from doing the due diligence required to determine if they are an entrepreneur or if they might make the jump. And
Yeah, and on the same token, a lot of people grow up in families that are entrepreneurial and they decide, you know what, that's not for me.
certainly,
That's not for me. But you knew it was for you.
I did.
Did you always know you wanted to become a financial advisor, or what you wanted to do as you went down your entrepreneurial journey?
No, I didn't. Initially, I thought I wanted to be, very early on, I got turned on to the sport of golf, and I thought that I would become a professional athlete. I learned very quickly that the caliber in which you needed to play in order to do anything in that sport was way above my skill level. So my backup plan was to become a golf professional or a PGA professional, where your time is spent in teaching lessons. And so I worked one summer at a golf course for a mentor that I still stay in contact, who was a great mentor, and I learned a lot from him. But what I noticed very quickly was that PGA of America pros, they don't actually get to play any golf. Their time is spent looking out the window at the golf course and dealing with angry customers and scheduling tee times and selling merchandise. Actually getting out on the golf course was actually quite rare.
Yeah.
And so I also determined after a summer of doing that is not what I wanted to do for a career path. But what I noticed in working at the golf course was that certain people would play every day of the week and in the middle of the day. And I wondered, what do those people do? How can they get away from their job? And what I determined was they owned companies, or they were partially retired, or they had done something right in life to afford the luxury of being able to play golf at noon on a Wednesday.
Yeah.
And so I thought to myself, I better get a business degree, because at least then I would have a chance. The other thing that happened, my mentor at the time, he invested in the stock market. He was very active in researching, and he kicked my curiosity of investing in the stock market into overdrive. And I took some of the money I made that summer and started buying a few stocks that he recommended. And
How old were you at this point?
I was 17. And then when I graduated at 18, I used some of the money that I got for a graduation present to really up my stakes in, some small companies and medium-sized companies, and start doing the due diligence and the research, and just based on his tips and, some of the things that he had given me to.
What year was this?
This would have been 2004, 2005.
Okay, so before the Great Recession.
Correct.
Okay, so you're getting your feet wet in the stock market. You're starting to figure out that you really like this industry per se.
Yeah, and I was making some money, and so
Yeah.
that's super fun. And you spent a little bit of the summer working and making some money, but I was making much faster returns. Leading up. Obviously, the market was doing well in those years leading up to the GFC, and so it was fun. It was exciting, and it was great. I enjoyed it, and that's kind of where my journey began with investing. And
so take a step back. You said your family has a business. You grew up with entrepreneurship around you. Give us a little bit about the business, how it started, and why it wasn't a natural fit for you just to go into the business. Did you want that? Did you not want that? Were there opportunities to do that? Because you see that oftentimes when families start a business, whether it's 100 years old, 200 years old, it's a natural progression to want to have your kids be in the business.
Certainly. So my dad was always adamant that I would go to college and get a degree, but I worked in the business growing up. So my family is in the cheese business, and quintessential Wisconsin, as we joke about often.
Yep.
Growing up in Wisconsin, your family must be in the cheese business. So actually they are. The next thing most people say to me is, well, you probably had cows. How many cows did you have? And I always have to remind them that we didn't have any cows. We didn't actually get the milk. We bought the milk and we made cheese out of it. So I watched my family, it was my dad and his two brothers, They bought the business from their father. And so it would seem that that was a natural progression for me. What I learned in working there really from 8 or 9 years old, I would go in with my dad on the weekends. And then in high school, I worked in the summer and part-time during the school year. And I knew I wanted to go to college, get some experience, figure out what I really wanted to do. And ultimately, the decision to either go back or stay really came down to, we're in a super small town, as you know, 1,900 people. The things that I like to do, like the golf and some of the other things I enjoy, like nice restaurants and just having some more activity in a community that just didn't exist in the little town where I'm from. And so I could have commuted from a bigger town, kind of like 2 hours a day. Today where people are working remote or working hybrid, that just didn't exist. My family was old school and said, if you want to be in the business, you need to be here every day. And I certainly respect that. But it just, for me, I wanted to go do my own thing. You know how when you're young and full of energy, you say, oh, I can do that. I can go out and forge my own path, and I don't need anybody to help me. And so there was certainly that level of, probably overconfidence. And I quickly got kicked in the teeth, as I mentioned. And so that was a good dose of reality that I needed, and certainly that matured me. And
no,
that kind of leads us to where you and I reconnected post college, and that dovetails into our story.
Well, so you had an opportunity to go back into the business at one point when you were a financial advisor.
Yeah, I think about year 3, my dad kind of said to me like, "Hey, there's probably a role for you. Are you interested?" And I don't remember at the time. I'm sure I made some
smart aleck
remark or demand for a salary, which I think the last time I did that, I was about 10 years old, and he made me stand in the corner. He didn't quite make me stand in the corner this time around, but I think he kind of knew that. And I was starting to have some success, and it was year 3, and you start to get some clients, and I wasn't great at reaching out and forging new relationships and doing the cold calling thing, but the one thing I was okay at was in financial services, specifically wealth management, the turnover is quite high. And so I started to make some relationships with my work colleagues, and the turnover, when they would leave, I would pick up a few clients. I figured out a way to, in a couple of cases, acquire their clients for, pennies on the dollar. Basically, when you leave that business, if you're not going to a different place, your clients are just kind of house accounts. And so as you're walking out the door, you say, well, if Adam's going to give me, 10 cents on the dollar, at least I get something to show for my work. And so I put 3 or 4 of those together over like kind of year 3, 4, and 5, kind of let me even out, help me even out the business and have it be a little more consistent month after month instead of always eating what you kill.
So essentially someone goes into the business, they see that there's these other advisors and they're making all this money, and they're like, I can do that. And then they start hitting the streets and they realize, well, you got to build trust and it takes time. And so they leave the business when you say there's a lot of turnover. And so let's say they develop a clientele of 20 or 25 people, and maybe they have assets under management of, I'm just making up numbers here, but 300,000. And they decide this is not for me. And there you are saying, hey, I'm doing the business. I enjoy it. Your clients need someone to manage their money. Well, can I buy your book of business? And that's how you started to grow, kind of not necessarily organic growth, but young M&A, really mergers and acquisitions.
Yeah, it really was. And I didn't think about it that way at the time. I was just thinking that, if you got 3 or 4 or 5 of these, they weren't enough to pay the bills for that individual. But if you put 3 or 4 or 5 together, all of a sudden, that was decent. And they were bigger sums of money than that, but it totally comes down in that world to what kind of asset it is. Is there, certain revenue associated with holding onto that asset, or did they get paid? You could have a $100 million book of business, but if it was all upfront commissions and it pays nothing, it's basically worth nothing. So it was a mix mash of different clients and different people, and Zoom really wasn't a thing at the time, and so I put 50,000 miles on my car every year, driving all over the state of Wisconsin, Minnesota. I don't know if we have time for a quick story, but my favorite one of all time, I drove about 2 hours southwest of Eau Claire, where we lived, and it was a referral from another customer who did quite well, and she had this woman that she referred me had the same job, and so I assumed that she had done well, and there was probably an opportunity, and so without really doing much due diligence, I hopped in the car and I drove 2 hours. And I got to the door, and it was 1 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and there was a very angry dog in the front yard. barking obsessively at me. And so I got out of the car, I went to the door, I kind of got the dog, you know, it didn't seem like it was overly, going to bite me or anything. I get to the door, I knock on the door, and the woman answers in a bathrobe. And I said, I'm so sorry, am I at the right place? Because I did a lot of house calls at the time. It was almost entirely house calls. And she said, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I didn't know that. I totally forgot that today was, Wednesday or whatever. If you'd go back to your car and wait for me, I'll get dressed. And I said, okay. So I close the door, and as I'm walking back to the car, the dog bites me in the leg. And so I'm sitting in my car, hopeful that this was going to be worth my while because it had already been quite stressful.
I haven't heard this story before. Wow.
And so she invites me in, and her husband returns home from work. And come to find out that, I don't remember if they're in their 50s or 60s, but they were trying to figure out how to retire in a few years, and they had saved nothing for retirement. And they had hoped that I was their saving grace to figure out how to retire. And, I'm trying to compose myself, and so I, start talking about their income and what their expenses are in very rudimentary, financial advisory work. And trying to figure out if they could spare any monthly income to save. And, you had 3 years, so basically they'd have to save all their income, which they weren't willing to really save anything. And so basically I spent 4 hours and got bit by the dog. And so that was some of the, that was some of the things that you'd run into. You just never knew. At the same time, a client could have $10,000 with you, and they could have just inherited millions. And so it certainly was Easter egg hunting. The rewarding, stories are the ones that kept you going. But it certainly was, as a young single guy, you still get burned out, running all over the place and living out of your car. And so kind of what happened there towards the end of that stint for me was as I read the book Rich Dad, Poor Dad by Robert Kiyosaki.
Mm-hmm.
And Robert really had a bunch of great points about investing in real estate, and his viewpoint and his perspective, long story short, I went hook, line, and sinker, and I just, this is like 2011, 2012, we're coming out of the great financial crisis. There are a lot of opportunities. Real estate investing was certainly not sexy at the time, and so I read that book, and I didn't have any money at the time to invest, but it's funny how things happen sometimes in life. I got referred to a client. They had a large sum of money. I made a giant commission, and basically every dollar that I made on that commission I used to buy my first fourplex. And so that was my foray into real estate. And that eventually, as you know, led me to, move to Arizona and pursue real estate and a million other things that we don't have enough time to talk to your listeners about today. But
that's such a great story. So a couple things I want to focus on. So a lot of people think of financial advisors. Some people are not familiar with them. Some people, there are some, just like in every industry, there are some financial advisors who are in it for the wrong reasons, and there's other financial advisors that are in it for the right reasons. But at the end of the day, you think of someone like yourself, it is really building a small business, and it's
certainly
hard work. It's funny for you to talk about house calls. For any of you guests that are, maybe 18 or younger or 25 or younger, that's probably a foreign concept because you grew up in the world of Zoom and YouTube, and in this post-COVID era, going house to house, it would be unheard of. But that's how it was back then.
Yeah, certainly. And I'm only 35. I'll be 36 next month. That seems like archaic, but it really, until the pandemic in 2019, face-to-face interaction, physically face-to-face interaction was the way everything was done, especially when you're dealing with someone's life savings or.
Yeah, and it's a lot of work. But I think the other key point is, even after you went through 4 to 5.5 hours to hopefully, I'm going to use the word acquire a customer, but that's not gain a new client, it didn't work out. But you kept on doing it. You've got to try again. That's basically the nature of entrepreneurship. And it worked out well for you because ultimately, how did you make that transition? You built up a nice practice and you ended up selling it, right?
I did. After about 5.5 years, my real estate portfolio. So my plan was to do, basically, for those that have a background in real estate, if you can buy a property and live in it, you might have to live in it a year. You qualify for long-term, traditional financing from the government. So you have, as long as you live there for 12 months. So my plan was to buy 5 properties, one every year for 5 years, and basically live in one and then move to the next and move to the next. What ended up happening is I bought 4 properties, 16 units in total, in about 18 months. And in that time, I teamed up with a business partner who was trying to do similar things, and that's how we ultimately ended up in Arizona, with big aspirations and similar to my early naive days in financial advising. I thought that I would move to Arizona, and the world was my oyster, and I would just dominate. Of course, that's not what happened, and I learned the hard way that building regulations and requirements in out here are very much different than small town Wisconsin. And I'll never forget the permit I went to get in the house that I was working on there. Basically, you go to the permitting department and you say, hey, I'm going to do this and a little bit of that. And they say, you're not going to do any electrical or plumbing, right? And I said, nope. And they give you a permit, and it's $80, and away you go. And you basically can do whatever you want. In Arizona, you have to get pre-applications, and you have to go through asbestos testing, and you have to do, the regulations are onerous, and you can only paint your building certain shades and certain colors, and it's a totally different ballgame.
Yeah, it's even a totally different ballgame from where we're from now. But I had my own experience in Minneapolis where I think you know of it.
No, it's a great story. You need to do a whole episode on just that one episode.
We've talked about failures, and as I've shared in the past, I've got 10 books full of failures, but I ultimately ended up with a vacant lot, and there used to be a house on it, and basically forced by the city, and then a brand new garage that was 1.5 years old, and they said, well, no house, you got to tear the garage down. So we had to tear the garage down. But
I think I remember that, drinking cocktails with you in Minneapolis, and you said, for crying out loud, I got to get a permit for the rats to run out of the building, and then I got to get another one to kill the rats, and I got to get a third permit to... Anyway.
It was a wake-up call for me, too, and I had done no real estate in Eau Claire, where we're from. But how did you get the capital? Because that's a big question for a lot of entrepreneurs. Well, where do I get the money? And I've shared that, my previous business partner, Jeff, and I, when we were in the garbage company, which when Adam was building the real estate, he graciously chose us as his garbage
I was a customer.
Yeah, he was a customer.
Multiple properties.
I remember. I think I remember pretty much all the properties that you were when I go back and think about 16 units. And it's not like you and I met in college, just giving our audience and we were on what was called the Student Investment Management Program. And it's a 2-year program. Basically, you're managing funds for the foundation of the university. Great program. We can have another episode where we get into more details of what it was, but it also that's where you talk about getting interested in the financial world and stocks. And we were both in that.
Yeah, that was really gasoline for me because as I said earlier, my journey started, late in high school with my mentor at the golf course. And student investment management was very much the catalyst that said, okay, investing other people's money, I'm comfortable with that. That's what I want to do for a living. And so having that be at the end of our college days, it also was great preparation for all the exams and the series tests and whatnot. And so...
yeah, and a big confidence builder. Now the second year of it, you and I were seniors. You and I weren't necessarily friends in college, but we weren't enemies. We had very different lifestyles. Sure. I was a kind of a 4.0 loser, and you were the normal college kid that did what he needed to do, but also enjoyed it.
Well, and I played collegiate golf at the time, and so that was demanding and a lot going on, certainly.
Now, we recircled at some point later on, but getting back to...
I think you were in Minneapolis at the time, and I think we connected.
And you had already bought a bunch of properties at this point, correct?
I'm trying to remember if that was... Maybe I was just getting started.
Okay. Yeah. Now, so where'd you get the capital to buy the properties? That's every entrepreneur. I want to start a business, but I haven't been able to save the money, whether you're young, whether you're in your 30s and 40s and you have a family, and so your capital is being spent elsewhere. How did you do it?
So it was interesting. The capital on my first property was a 4-unit building. I still remember do you want me to talk specifics?
Yeah.
I still remember what and then the second one I did was even more interesting. So the first property I bought was, I think I paid $140,000 for, which is just crazy to think about because, you can't buy anything. You can't buy a shed on a piece of land for $140,000 anywhere anymore. It needed some work. And I think I needed like $23,000 to close on that deal, which I didn't have. And it happened that we were working with, at that time, there was a frac sand boom going on in western Wisconsin. For those of you that are in the oil and gas industry, You need that frac sand to get the gas and oil out of the ground. And for whatever reason in western Wisconsin, when the glaciers went through, they deposited this perfect sand. It's perfectly round if you look at it under a microscope. And so somehow we got hooked into a family through one of the senior advisors that I was friendly with in the office. And he said, hey, we need some help with this. It's a lot of money that this family's about to get. And we need a young guy basically to do all the work. We'll pay you 10% to do all the work for us.
Yeah.
Which I was more than happy to do because I was young and full of energy. And so I can't remember if it was that deal plus another one or anyway, I had a great month and I literally got like $500 more than what I needed to close on this property. And it kind of all happened in tandem and it was a big deal. And again, I don't remember all those numbers specifically, but it was that one and maybe one other one, and it all kind of came together. And so that was how I did the first deal. My first fourplex, it was owner occupied, so you needed less money down, and you got better rates and whatnot. So I lived in one unit and rented the other 3 out, and I was living for a net positive $150 a month. And so to be able to, not only not have a rent payment, but also, be making a little bit of money.
That's fantastic on your first real estate
it was
deal.
a one-room apartment that I lived in, and
Yep.
it was not certainly not fancy, but worked out great. And then immediately, I think probably like 6 months later, this 8-unit building came up for sale downtown, and I, of course, didn't have any more cash because I had used it all for the first one, and my income was just starting to get to the point where, it was decent, but it wasn't enough to close on that one, and so I tied it up. And my good friend.
When you say you tied it up, so you're 3 in your financial advisor business, right?
Approximately
you're 3. What do you mean you tied it up?
Well, a friend of mine said, "Hey, this building's coming for sale. Like, what do you think?" And I said, I don't have the resources to do that. And he said, well, you should at least talk to the bank, like they did the first one. Maybe there's a creative solution, or what? At least you should look at it. And so my friend that eventually bought me out of my business in year 5.5, he was 2 years ahead of me, and so he had good income and good credit. And so I said, well, why don't you come along? I'll do all the work. I'll give you 50% of the profits, which turned out to be a really awesome deal for him. I'll do all the work again, all the sweat equity, all the everything, but I need you to, co-sign the loan with me. And so as it worked out, I recall at the closing table, because the property needed some work, we got a line of credit. I remember we both maxed out 2 balance transfer credit cards, which, early on you've done some investing.
I'm aware.
How that works. And so I think we brought about $30,000 to close. It was all borrowed on a credit card. And we put that money down, and we got, I think at closing, we got a check for $5,000 and the keys. And so, again, those deals don't come around all the time, but it was the right deal, right time. This is, 2012 or 2013. And the property needed a lot of work. I basically would do my financial advisor job for 50 hours a week. And then I'd go there from 6 to 10 at night and rip up flooring and paint. And
you worked your tail off.
Worked my butt off.
Yeah.
And I got that thing stabilized where it was, I think there were 8 units and maybe 4 of them had tenants at the time, and they were all below market, and, they were in pretty rough shape.
I love that story for multiple reasons. You talk about, number one, you're honest with someone. Sometimes some people are afraid to say, I don't have the resources to do this, but I want to do it. There's no shame in that, especially when, at any age, but when you're young, you had just bought one of your properties, but you found someone who's a little bit further on their career, and you basically helped his capital and his probably income got you approved to a certain degree.
Oh, certainly. Without him, to be clear, without him, I wouldn't have been able to qualify.
But you said, I'll do all the work. And a lot of people are like, wait a minute, why do I got to do all the work? Well, in this scenario, it was a mutually beneficial instance. And I think that's so key, because a lot of people think when you go into a business partnership, it's going to be equal work, equal this. No, there's a lot of different ways you can go into business partnership where it works for one party. There are different stages in their life cycle. And it also works for the other party because exactly what you said, you're going to put all the sweat equity. I think what's important there is that was very defined up front.
It was. And there's always, you've done deals like that where somebody that's maybe senior to you says, I'll give you the money, but they had the cash. So money talks, honey.
Cash is king.
That's right.
But I think a lot of people are like, why do I got to do all the work? you got to stop thinking about that, especially if you're just getting started. There are people out there who have the capital. They've gone through it all. There's nothing wrong with a business partner like that, where they're going to provide the capital and you're going to do all the work, and it's going to work out great for both of you. I think the key piece again there is you're both going into it with open eyes and you know exactly what everybody's responsibility is.
Yeah, and I mean, I wouldn't say that it was that perfect and clear. And there were certainly nights where you're there till midnight where your business partner's home with his family and you're going, well, what the heck am I doing here all night? But certainly that arrangement exists. And if you're willing to I think the message you're trying to get across, if you're willing to do the work, there's always opportunity out there. And so I'm just used to getting my hands dirty and putting my head down and moving forward. And so that was really, that defined my first two deals. I did a lot of the work myself. You know, you call in plumbers and electricians for the stuff that is, you know, too complicated or over my head. And it's amazing what you can get done if you're willing to put in the time and effort and put your head down.
Yeah, you put your mind to it. And I think to the point, you know, life's not fair. But in that scenario, it wasn't about not being fair. It was you guys came to an agreement. It worked out great. Yep. I've certainly been there, even when you are 50-50 with business partners and you're like, well, it seems like I'm doing all the work. But let's talk about business partners. You've had good business partners. You've had bad business partners, just like I have. If you could provide any advice to someone as to whether they should have a business partner or not, or if they're thinking about going into business with someone, what advice can you give them? What would you say?
So I thought about this one a lot because I knew that you would grill me on this. And, you know, I think about, or I relate business partners to dating. You know, when you're young and you're out in the dating scene, you first of all, you don't really know what you're looking for. And second of all, you don't really know, you're young and you haven't really figured out who you are and what you want. And so I'd relate business partners very similarly. My early business partners were just people that were around and shared similar interests. And I did very little due diligence and I asked very few questions. And I said, hey, you want to do this? And I want to do this. Let's go. I didn't know what their skills or strengths were. I just basically, you know, this is who's here and let's go. Let's.
But they weren't strangers.
I mean, define a stranger. I mean, I've had numerous business partnerships, or even trial balloons where we had an idea and I met someone and they seemed like a, you know, upstanding person, and quickly realized that maybe that's not maybe not the person I want to be in business with, or maybe that's not the industry I want to be in. So I certainly think that you need to think about as a listener, you need to think about what your strengths are, and also more importantly probably is what are your weaknesses. And I think that was something that I certainly, you know, every partnership I've had ones that have succeeded and quite a few that have failed. And I certainly have a whole bunch of personal responsibility. When you're young and naive and arrogant, certainly some of the ones that didn't work out were a lot my fault or mostly my fault. And but at the same time, you know, sometimes relationships just don't work for a variety of reasons. You know, you date someone and you find out you have things that you disagree on. It's going to be hard to get over some non-negotiables. And so business partnerships are similar. And I wouldn't discourage anyone from trying and going through the process and spending that time trying to get to know somebody. Some things you just don't know until you're in the heat of the battle. You can think someone's great and that you're on the same page and you view things from the same lens. But when times get tough, that's where you're really, just like, you know, I think about my relationship with my wife, and we've been together for 12 years, and we've been through a lot, and we know that in tough times, we're both willing to dig in and do what it takes to get the job done. It's no different. And, you know, relationships in any scale are tested when you get down in the trenches together.
So what would you say to someone who maybe is in a business partner or in a business relationship where things are going tough, someone who they thought they were, it's not working out? Because I know you've been there. We've all been there.
Certainly.
What's the best advice to how to handle that?
Well, try and leave emotion out of it whenever possible, because that certainly gets people to say things they don't mean or things that make the relationship irreparable. But in all relationships, communication is key. If you are respectful and you put your feelings out on the table, probably to back up before you do that, look yourself in the mirror and say, hey, is this relationship difficult because I'm being a jerk? A good healthy dose of self-reflection is always,
That's a great point.
very helpful.
Yeah.
And if you determine, well, I think I'm being reasonable, and a reasonable, outsider looking at this would say that I am, where are the sticking points? Where are the problems? And just a lot of times I feel if I look back at the failed relationships, I knew early on, that'd be another one, speak up. Most of us know if things are going well or not going well. And if they're not going well, you need to be real with yourself and say, okay, this isn't going well. Why? And then be honest with your partner and say, hey, you know what? This was great. I respect you. I just don't think this is, what I want and where I'm trying to go. And it's likely if you're feeling that, they're probably feeling similar. I mean,
Yeah.
You've experienced that.
I think you've said something. There's a tendency, I think it's a human tendency for when you see cracks, not just in business relationships, but a particular problem maybe within the business, you want to kind of push it under the rug because you don't want to deal with it, or you just hope it's going to get itself better. That never will work.
And I don't love conflict. I've gotten better as I get older in trying to take conflict head on, but certainly what happens is you sweep it under the rug and then it becomes a bigger and bigger deal, and eventually the thing implodes. And so, again, I relate a lot of my, relationships to my wife. And if I would just sweep things or she would sweep things, and we have a very open and honest relationship, and that's served us very well because we know what each other are thinking and there's no surprises. And unfortunately, in my failed business relationships, I can definitely look myself in the mirror and say, I should have spoke up there. I should have, expressed how I felt. And sometimes it can be, difficult. You could have an intimidating business partner that tries to, that's controlling. And so I tend to be less controlling and kind of take the back seat. And eventually what happens then is that blows up in your face too. So it totally depends on the person. It depends on the relationship. No one size fits all advice here, certainly. And I don't have it all figured out. But what I would say, I think the overarching message is don't give up. If you've had a bad relationship, look yourself in the mirror and try and analyze why that was. But don't stop, because if I would have stopped, I wouldn't have reconnected with you. And certainly Robert Kiyosaki talks about that in his book, where that was one of his major messages. He goes, I've had many business partners. Most of them were terrible. But the ones that I have that really have worked out, I've found some of my absolute, lifelong friends and partnerships by continuing to look and continuing to push and continuing to talk and not giving up. And so I think that's a major message for your audience, that you just can't give up. Just because you had one bad one doesn't mean that you should never try and have one again.
Yeah, what you just said actually sparked something. When I think about my successes and failures, I've had way more failures, and you learn from all
Certainly.
of them. But not even talking about business partners, but just talking about businesses. But as long as the successes outweigh the failure, you'll eventually find what you're good at, what you like, the industries you want to be in. And if you don't give up, you'll find the right business partners.
Certainly, and it's similar to dating. After you've dated for a while, you go, okay, this is what I'm looking for, and this is who I am, and this is what's important to me. And in a partner, I'm looking for X, Y, and Z. And so I think you get better at asking the right questions. And I hated this growing up when someone elder to me in the business would say, like, oh, you don't have the experience, like you lack the experience. And I would think to myself, like, you have no idea. Like, I got it all figured out over here.
I did the exact same thing.
And in reality, you have no clue what you're doing. And so now looking back, after being in the, entrepreneurial world for 15 years, you start to go, okay, I understand what they were saying. And you learn what's important to you and what's important in a partner, whether that be in a loving relationship or a business.
Yeah. There's, secularly speaking, 3 things you can't buy: time, love, and experience. I always say that.
I hated that, but I understand it now. I respect it. I still don't love it, but
I always do. You hated that saying. But so you get into real estate and tell us, obviously we both live in Arizona now.
Yep.
I'm in Arizona because of you.
Yep.
You're in Arizona because of a previous business partner.
Yep.
So
no, actually my best friend growing up.
Oh, yeah.
That's how I was introduced to Arizona. And so when I got into real estate, I partnered up with a local guy, sold my business. I came on with him. He was developing real estate and building out a quite large portfolio for our area at the time. But I had started coming to Arizona when I think it was my senior year of high school. My best friend, still one of my best friends, Joe, his family had a second home here. And I came out I think it was for spring break, my senior year. And I had no idea in February, March, and April that you could play golf and ride your bicycle. And growing up in central Wisconsin, January and February are
You
usually,
hide.
usually below zero and
Yeah.
cloudy. And I came to Arizona, and the sun shines every day, and the birds chirp, and it's beautiful, and you can play golf and ride your bicycle, which are two of my favorite things in the world. And so it just blew my mind. I had my buddy Joe didn't live here at the time, and so I was very much a tourist. I knew nobody. I made a couple of connections so that I could make clients out here once I got out of school. But it really took me that 5 years of being in Wisconsin and both growing my practice and doing real estate to, have the means to say, okay, I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna take the jump. And my business partner in real estate at the time, I convinced him that he really should have a branch of his business in Arizona. And so my job was to come out here and use all my worldly experience, which I really had none of in real estate development at the time, to build out a portfolio in Phoenix.
So that's what brought you out here. You guys were going to franchise, weren't you?
Well, we had looked at he had a number of different businesses, and basically we were going to proof concept here and then figure out how to grow them. We looked at acquiring some businesses. We met with some business brokers. We did a whole bunch of due diligence, and ultimately my goals were different than what my partners were back in Wisconsin. And so we acquired one commercial property in about 2.5 years. It was a nightmare to redevelop. I had no idea what I was doing. Basically, we got our butts kicked, and we decided, and I think about 2015 or 2016, I can't remember the dates exactly, to go our separate ways. And so at the time, we had hard money loans, we had debt up the wazoo, and I had to figure out how to both buy him out of what was his and finish this project that basically was unfinanceable because it was half finished. And a friend of ours had lent us hard money. I mean, it was really, those were some pretty dark days trying to figure. And I'm out here by myself where I don't really know anybody. And so basically, when you move to a new town, as anybody that's done that can attest, you basically get put on the list of, hey, this is the new guy, so we're going to charge him the most. We're going to, he's got no idea what he's doing. And so I made all those mistakes. Luckily, that timing worked out in the long term. Because we've been in this easy money run for, 12 years. So everything went up in value. And even though I made every mistake imaginable, we still were, profitable at the end of the project. But that was some interesting times where I had to scramble and find some different partners and find some different financing and finish this project in order to get it all over the finish line. It's what I eventually did.
Yeah, I think those can be the messy if you do get into the wrong business partnership and you're down that far down the path with hard money financing, and that's when it can become challenging. So you said those were some very dark days.
Yeah, as you can tell, my risk tolerance was basically infinity at that time.
So I want to go back to those days because I think we talk often on this podcast, and you've said it multiple times yourself today, don't give up, grit, perseverance. And I think some of the ways that we do that as entrepreneurs is hearing how other entrepreneurs got through the darkest days. So talk to us about those dark days, the thoughts, the volatility, and how you got through them.
Give me a second. So yeah, those were some real dark days. And, cycling for me was always an outlet. So I rode my bike a lot. Luckily, we're in Arizona where you can ride that thing 365 days a year. And I beat the heck out of it because that's what I needed to do for my mental sanity. I tried to forge relationships and get to know people and at least develop some trusted relationships. I had one friend at the time who ultimately became my partner in that real estate project. And again, timing is everything. It had worked out that he had sold a property and done really well. And it just so happened he had the exact amount of dollars that I needed to buy out this other partner in Wisconsin and keep the project going. And that was a large sum of money at the time. I think it was like $200,000 that he basically coughed up. And I mean, we were friends, but certainly it was a new relationship. Mm-hmm. And we became 50-50 partners in that first deal. And without him, I would have been in a real amount of, real high level of hurt, both with private money and with a bank loan for part of the deal. And so it was tough, but I think that there's a saying, stop thinking and keep working, basically, is what I kept telling myself. Just got to get it done, got to get it over the finish line, got to get tenants in there and get it occupied so that you get long-term financing and pay off all the high-interest debt.
And so you've
That's
had
what we did ultimately.
you've had a lot of great timing incidents. The first property that you bought, and you happened to connect with a client. And sometimes, as you said, timing is everything.
It is.
It's incredible how that works. Now, we focus on the successes in timing. There's a lot of times, at least for me, where the timing didn't work out.
Oh, I can get to those in the pandemic. And I mean, how many hours do we have here to talk about this?
So let's talk about, if you're an entrepreneur. I want to take a step back in terms of what you talked about. You grew up with it, so it wasn't as scary. Your risk tolerance was really high. What would you say to someone who's maybe 35, 40, 45? And I know your risk tolerance has changed.
Certainly
you and I
has.
have talked about this.
Certainly.
And they're stuck in, I don't even want to say a dead-end job, but a job that they feel a slave to.
Or less fulfilled than what they might hope.
Exactly.
Certainly.
And they
Which I think is a lot of people.
Yeah, I think it's a majority of people. And that's, again, why I wanted to start this podcast, because I think that fear can prevent so many people who are born to be entrepreneurs to becoming entrepreneurs.
Certainly.
What advice would you give them when they're thinking about making that leap, or what can you tell them that not will help it make it easier for them, but give them the vote of confidence they need to do it?
One thing that comes to mind is I'm a big believer in the side hustle. I think that's an awesome low risk way to not just, I can't imagine anybody, whether they have a spouse or if they have children, to just quit their job cold turkey. I keep bringing up Robert Kiyosaki, but he's got a great book called 9 Things to Do Before You Quit Your Job, I think is what it's called. And basically it lays out ways to trial run and test run different business ideas. In today's age, if it's anything on the internet, you can do it on nights and weekends and remote. Big fan of the, the 10-hour work week?
Yep.
Is that what it's called?
I think it's a 10-hour work week, yeah.
And he talks a lot about outsourcing to India and different countries. And so you can basically multiply yourself in a number of different ways. And so there's all these services and different help that you can get basically to start a business in today's age, which you couldn't years ago. And so my advice to anybody thinking about it is come up with a business plan, figure out an idea that you want to execute on, and give it some attention, nights and weekends. That means you might have to give things up, going out with your friends or staying up late or doing other activities, personal activities. But I think that's the lower risk way to do it instead of just quitting cold turkey and jumping in with both feet. If you're going to do that, you definitely want to have a big nest egg and really a clear understanding with those around you, because if you don't have buy-in from your spouse or your family or your children, you're really setting yourself up to put your family in a position that you might not be able to get out of.
Yeah.
And I think that happens too, where people, you kind of get the cart before the horse and they just quit their job and say, hey, I'm going all in. And they don't really take the time to spend and do the planning and the due diligence and develop the relationships. And once you kind of leave your job, especially I think about what the labor market's looking like, this time. And I don't know if you can get your old job back.
Yeah.
And so a side hustle is a great opportunity to prove concept and figure out, hey, is this something that'll work? And if it does, great. Well, then at least you can jump right in. You're not scrambling and starting from zero.
I love that
when you
suggestion.
do quit your job.
Yeah, I love that suggestion. The side hustle makes a lot of sense. And it's so much more doable in 2023 than it was, when we came out of college, 2008, 2009, 2010. You talked on something that I think is really important, a support system and the people around you. You've been an entrepreneur your entire life. Your wife, Andrea, and you have talked about that a lot. And I don't know if her risk tolerance is different than yours. Maybe it's as you guys have grown together, it's
Certainly.
become more so,
Yeah.
but still a little bit different. But talk to us about how important it is to have the support system around you. And when you found bypasses in this, and it doesn't have to be a spouse, it can just be your friends, it can be family, because it has an impact on everybody around you. How have you found the most effective ways to work through some of those challenges when there are risk tolerance differences?
Well, it's a great question. There's no one-size-fits-all solution to that, obviously. But what I will say is that it's imperative that you have great support system, because without it, you're basically setting yourself up for failure. And I think about those that are around me, from my wife Andrea to my friends. I've kind of gravitated towards those that have similar beliefs or similar risk tolerances. certainly call my dad every once in a while and say, hey, I got this thing. Like, can you make rhyme or reason over what I need to do here? And though it might be a different industry, you can at least tell me a similar story or give me some advice. So that's certainly helpful. But that's kept me from making a lot of mistakes by bouncing ideas and getting feedback from those that have either been there. I will say, too, I think this is something that is dying in our society with our younger population, but having a mentor is so important, or multiple mentors. You can learn so much from those that have been there and done it before. And so I've always gravitated towards those with experience and some level of success that have, that have been there and done that. And that's helped me so much and kept me going. I definitely, you asked earlier about what got me through some of those dark days, and those are the people that got me through, and that I'm forever grateful that kept my sanity and kept me moving forward.
Yeah, when I think about that, you've always told me from early on, mentors have been really important, and it's something that I've learned a lot from you about. That is listening to people with, I was pretty arrogant and headstrong when I was young, and I think as you get knocked in the teeth and you realize, boy, that was all pointless. I could have just gone to someone who's already done this before, and you kind of wash away that arrogance, or I can do it better, or just go to people that have done it before. Ask them for help. There's nothing wrong with asking for help.
And I don't want to say that that's a cure that fixes everything, because sometimes depends who they are in your life. You might think that someone's a good mentor, they have good advice, but it might actually be the wrong advice. So you do need to have your own filter. I think that you need to be open-minded and listen. That doesn't mean that you're always going to take everybody's advice, because your situation's always going to be different, and they probably haven't experienced exactly what you're going through. But it's always been helpful. I don't know if my mother and father instilled that in me early on, the need for a mentor, but I've always kind of had different mentors throughout life, people that I've looked up to, people that I've respected. And I talked about the golf pro that mentored me in the stock market, of all things. You wouldn't think that would be something that he was interested in. I still stay in contact with him. I mean, that's been almost 20 years.
That's awesome.
And so I've always valued experience, and even though I said that I didn't early on, I have always valued help from mentors and feedback and guidance.
So, Adam Eggebrecht today, 2023, we're going to jump ahead. So you went down here. Obviously, you were working through a building, parted ways with your partner at the time, found a new business partner. How did that turn out? How did you get into owning what you own today, now Regroup Coffee and Bicycles, which I'm part owner with you in? You and I kind of reconnect. I move out here.
Yep.
Tell us about that.
Well, a lot happened in there. So my first partner in the building, he had his own business, was successful on his own. So he was very much hands off. Let me do what I needed to do. And that worked out. We exited that property in 2020, 2021, I think it was, at the basically in the pandemic boom. Maybe it was late 2020.
So this is the partner that kind of came in when you were separating with the other partner who was going to leave you high and dry.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and so that was a quite good exit for us, and we sold the property. That's where we started Regroup Coffee and Bicycles. Basically, Regroup Coffee and Bicycles was started there because we looked all over, didn't really find any properties that we liked to lease when we started talking about that business. And the space we had makes sense. It was the right size, and it helped us reach our goal of being fully occupied so we could get long-term financing on the building, and it just worked out as oftentimes things do. And so
you didn't start the business just so you could have a tenant in the building,
well,
right?
No, certainly not, but we had looked all over, and it was certainly uneasy to sign a 5-year lease on a brand new business. And one of my partners at the time knew that I was working on that project, and he came over and he said, Adam, what are we doing? We've looked all over town. Like, let's do it right here. Like, this is a good location. It's not overly large. It helps you in your goals. Like, this makes sense. Let's do it. And so that's kind of Regroup and how it got started. And I had a bunch of business partners in that. I have a few less than I do now. And obviously you came into the business. But during that time, we got into the coffee business, and we thought we were going to, grow that into an empire. That's kind of where our journey comes back together.
Yep.
And so we learned a lot through the pandemic, and basically in 2022 and now in 2023, I'm trying to do less. I've decided that
You don't want 10 businesses at once?
Well, or 12 or 15 or whatever. There's only so much you to go around. And I'm certainly learning in my ripe old age of 35 that maybe I don't have the chutzpah that I used to have at 25 or at 20. And focusing and doubling down on what you have that has been there and made it through the ups and downs of the different markets that we've had the last 7 or 8 years.
So you started Regroup Coffee and Bicycle, which is a specialty coffee shop and more of a high-end bike shop in 2016.
Yeah, we're coming up on 8 years here, so 2017.
So
2016, you're right.
So a lot of people don't know what to get into. How did you end up in coffee and bikes? Okay, so financial advisor. I mean, you've been all over the place. Grow up with cheese, become a financial advisor, get into real estate. Then I think you were looking at a fire restoration business at some point.
Oh, the list is 100 miles long. We were going to do a smartwatch. We were going to do, basically I have an inability to focus.
I think that's I have the same thing, an entrepreneurial trait.
Yeah, we're dangerous for each other.
Yeah, so if you have that trait, you might want to ask yourself, maybe I should be an entrepreneur. Now, you eventually have to cajole that and learn how to harness that focus on one, maybe two, but primarily one thing. How did you get into coffee and bikes, though?
Yeah, I'll back up for a minute. I looking in the rearview mirror now, I have very few regrets in my life, and I wouldn't even call this a regret, but certainly I should have focused a little bit more for a little bit longer period of time just to get the business to where it was stabilized and then think about branching out.
Which business is this?
I think about Regroup and the other things we started around it and tried to grow too fast and spread ourselves too thin. So I certainly think about that, and those that have been along with me on this journey, I'm certainly appreciative because I've learned a lot about myself as a human and as an entrepreneur. And so to make a really long story really short, basically we tried to get into every aspect from coffee roasting to making our own bicycles to marketing to everything. And so what the pandemic certainly wasn't kind to some of those businesses. It was kind to others. And so what we've kind of got it down to now is a core, small group of companies that have the ability to make it and be around for the long run, in my opinion. After putting them through the test of the last couple of years, and those that didn't work out, we either sold off or closed down. And I want to talk about dark days and certainly stressful, a lot of failures, lots of things to look back on and say, man, I really wish I wouldn't have done that. But you got to keep in mind that makes you who you are, and what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And so here we are.
Yeah, I remember when we opened a brand new cafe 2 weeks before COVID.
Yep.
And having to lay off.
Yeah, we had 8 or 9 employees at the time, and everybody was bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and ready to go after and kick some butt. And basically, again, timing. There's timing on the other end. We brought it full spectrum here.
That happened to so many people. I mean, we had spent 2 or 3 months working so hard to have this big grand opening.
I spent 3 years on that project.
Yeah, you had done the building and then the business actual operation of just getting it ready to open. And you do the grand open, and then we realize the scope of this.
2 weeks in, we were forced to shut down, as a lot of places in the world, in our country were. And so what do you do? It's sad. You lay people off, and that was compounded by the operation we had in Colorado, and all of our customers basically going, we were selling wholesale, so all our retail customers had to close. And so basically your business went from a viable business to zero. And
because you were roasting beans yourself and you were selling them wholesale.
Well, I wasn't roasting them myself, but we had a team that was.
The company was selling them to other businesses, and basically it all stopped like that.
Yeah, restaurants and bars and retail cafes, those were our customers, and they all had to close too. And so basically your business went from viable to not viable with one swipe of the government's pen and their mandates to close down.
So you still haven't answered the question, why coffee and bikes? A lot of people don't know what to get into, and that is the only thing that is stopping them from taking that leap. How did you stumble upon this?
I had this conversation with my wife, about how do you know what business to start? And I don't know that anybody ever just wakes up one morning with a lightning bolt and says, shoes, that's what I'm going to do. I think that doing something is better than waiting for the perfect idea. I think too many people get stuck wondering like, oh, is this the right idea or is this the right idea? And they never act. I think that doing something is better than having the perfect idea. And so for Coffee and Bicycles, that was just a combination of both passions and interests, as well as another business about an hour from us where we grew up in Eau Claire. There was a similar concept, and I just thought it was the coolest thing. It had a community vibe and culture. It sold really nice things that I could afford none of in college, but I still appreciated the presentation and the attention to detail and the, just the level of quality of things that they had in that building. And so in Arizona, nothing like that existed. And I was young and naive, as I talked about. And so I said, well, let's do this. We got the space. We had there was 3 of us at the time that started it. And one of the partners' background was in fixing bikes and selling bikes. And so my other partner was a natural marketer, and I was good at counting the beans. And so we thought we were a dream team partnership. And I remember we sat at a Chipotle up the street and wrote the business plan on the back of a napkin, and the rest is history.
I love that go-get-'em attitude, and it's so important to have. The blissfulness of naivete when you're young is a real blessing, but it can also be a real curse.
Certainly.
But, at the same token, you did something. You just risked it.
Yep.
Now, you were younger, so it's easier to do. It's a lot harder if you're talking to someone who has a lot of responsibilities at 40 or 45. And I think what the advice you gave earlier, do a side hustle, see if it's going to work, helps dispel some
Certainly.
of that.
And the other thing I'll say is don't bet the farm. I see all too many and hear all too many stories of people that, took out a second mortgage on their home and maxed out every credit card they had and went into a business that maybe they either didn't have the knowledge of, or they went in half-cocked and they didn't seek, good people around them. And then the fallout, the calamity of that is really sad. And so I never bet the farm. Certainly there were points in time where I had too much debt or I, got in a pickle, but I never went so crazy that it was that I was unable to recover.
Yeah.
And so that's important to keep in mind. Certainly.
Yeah, I think that's
Until
great.
at least you have some proof of concept and you know that it's viable business.
That's the thing, until you have proof of concept. Now, you've been very gracious with your time, so I want to wrap this up here, but talk to me about one thing that I've noticed and I've really appreciated in Regroup Coffee and Bicycles, and I want you to talk about the importance of this and how you benefit from it. It's similar to the mentor concept, but it's vendor relationships. You've done a really good job of creating relationships with vendors. And talk to us about anybody who's thinking about getting maybe into a retail business, or where you are the ultimate seller of a product but not the maker, and how you do that, what benefits you've gotten from it, and how you can establish those relationships.
Well, people buy from people, whether that's wholesale or retail. And so I tend to gravitate towards those people that are similar, like-minded individuals and obviously share the same passion and interests that I do. And so I think it's like any other relationship. If you can connect on those, on those principles, the relationship is, usually quite easy in that case. I'll say that coffee helps. I mean, any place you go into and someone serves you a hot cup of coffee with a smile on their face, that certainly, nobody says no to that. But just being an upfront and honest person. I had a rep that came in the other day that we don't sell a lot of their stuff, but we connected on a human level and really had a great conversation. And, that's how those relationships are. They take time and they take effort. And, pretty quickly that vendors who are just trying to sell you something and who are actually good people and care about your business and care about you. And so I'd say that the cream rises to the top there. And some of those are really great friends, and some people are looking just more for a transactional relationship and
knowing which is which.
Their own. Yep.
Yeah, I love that. I think that we so often forget, and basically everybody that I've talked to on this podcast is talked about the human element. We so often forget that. You and I were talking about this earlier today. As companies get larger, people just become a number. Vendors become a number. Customers become a number. Employees become a number.
Yep, sales target.
They forget about. Take all the business out of this. These are humans.
Yeah.
We're all humans. We all want to be treated in the same way. Treat others as you would like to be treated. It's a really basic concept that if you can master and bring to your business, the world will be your oyster. And we've experienced that.
Certainly.
It starts with your vendors, your employees, your customers, of course, and it's just so easily forgotten.
Yeah, I'm very far from perfect or even having it together totally, but I enjoy the time getting to know people and the relationship and building that relationship. I don't think that relationships are dead. Maybe I'm naive, but I still think that there's people that if you have their back, they'll have yours. And I think too often in our society now, it's just very transactional, and our relationships are a mile wide and an inch deep instead of the opposite. And so that might be our Midwest roots. We talk too much. We probably get less work done than what we should because we spend all this time getting to know these people. But those relationships last a lifetime. And if I didn't have those, why even have the business? That's what at the end of the night, at the end of the day, you value and what makes it all worth it.
Yeah, I think that advice is worth its weight in gold. So, to conclude, is there anything that we haven't talked about?
I mean, we could go on for days here, probably.
Right, but so to sum it up, whether the best advice you could give if someone said, Adam, you're an experienced entrepreneur, you've been up, you've been down, you've been all around, what advice can you give me that's going to help me be successful? Other than what we talked about, and you've given a lot of great advice, mentors, side hustles, support group, keep going, do something. And we've heard that from a lot of guests on this podcast. But if you had to wrap it all up, what would you say to someone that's thinking about becoming an entrepreneur, or they just newly launched and things aren't going as well as they might otherwise want them to?
Well, entrepreneurship is a roller coaster, and so you need to go in eyes wide open. It will be a roller coaster. There will be great triumphs and terrible tragedies, probably in the same day or certainly in the same week. So don't let that surprise you. I mean, it's a ride that I can't imagine doing any other way. So I highly recommend it.
I think that's an excellent point of it's a roller coaster. It's an emotional roller coaster, the ups and downs and all arounds, and they happen very frequently, and they happen within the same day, within the same week. Be prepared with that. Go in with your eyes wide open.
Yeah, certainly. And entrepreneurship might not be for everyone, but you don't know until you try. So I'm always encouraging if somebody's thinking about starting a business or curious about starting a business. I mean, I love what you're doing with the podcast. I know that anybody that would reach out, you would give them your 2 cents, whether they want it or not. And so people need more places to go where they can feel that community and just bounce things off the wall. It helps so much to be able to call somebody, even when we weren't in business. I know we reconnected over our problems and our issues and how we get through these things. And that still is a part of our, for background, we basically have a coffee every day. We're together in the same town and just bounce ideas. And that's how you figure out what to do and where to go. And it's not always right, but it helps to have someone there to, that's got your back. And so, especially in the early days.
Yeah, and someone who understands what you're going through. And, to your point, I appreciate the kind words about the podcast because I started for that exact reason. You're two of the business in the garbage company. No one knew what I was going through. And of course I had my business partner, Jeff, but you're going through the thick of it with them. And sometimes you want to talk to someone else.
You're going in opposite directions.
Yeah. And you're both very emotionally involved and you want to talk with someone that's maybe experiencing it, but not in your direct situation.
An outside perspective is always helpful and important because you can get too ingrained in your business or get, too confident or too arrogant in something. And you need that outside kick in the pants every once in a while.
Yeah. It gives you clarity. Well, Adam, thank you so much for joining us here on the Andrew Holland podcast. I've loved all the advice you've given us. We didn't talk as much about, our background, how we came to reconnect, but
we'll have to do it again.
We'll have more episodes to do that. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
And of course, thank you guys for joining us again for another episode of the Andrew Holland podcast. Like we always talk about, this podcast is about all of us talking, just like the conversation that Adam and I have, the struggles, the successes, the failures. This podcast is only as good as we collectively make it. So if you want us to have particular guests on the podcast, let us know. If you have questions or topics that we're not covering or I'm not asking our guests and you're like, I really want to hear this, email me. theandrewhollandpodcast.com. And of course, you can tweet at me. My Twitter handle is @HollandPodcast. That's @HollandPodcast. And we'll continue the conversation outside of the podcast. We always do every week, not necessarily daily, but certainly multiple times throughout the week. As I said, subscribe to our YouTube channel as well if you want to watch the video version. Adam just got some new sophisticated glasses that I think make him look great, so you'll want to see him on the video version this week. That's the Andrew Holland Podcast. Go to YouTube, subscribe to the channel so you get the updates every week when that's released. A reminder, this is a financial and business podcast, so sometimes we talk about financial things, legal things, accounting things. Anything you hear on this podcast or any podcast, you don't want to necessarily apply to your direct situation without getting the appropriate legal and professional help to ensure that in your situation, you're making the right decisions. Thank you again so much for joining us for this podcast. We'll talk again next Wednesday, and have a great week. Thank you for listening to the Andrew Holland Podcast. Be sure to visit our website, theandrewhollandpodcast.com, for additional content on business, entrepreneurship, and everything in between. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Andrew Holland Podcast, to get notifications when new podcasts have been released. And lastly, follow us on Twitter, @Holland Podcast. That's @Holland Podcast for all the conversations we're having outside the podcast. Thanks again so much for joining us this week. Have a great day, and we'll talk again next week.